Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The stone house still stands at the edge of Morgan County, Missouri, where the rolling hills of the Ozarks begin their gentle climb toward the more rugged terrain to the south. It's a modest structure, built of local limestone, now partially reclaimed by the surrounding woodland. Most travelers along Highway 5 barely notice it through the trees, and fewer still know the peculiar story of Nora Belle, the woman who once lived there, a woman whose condition confounded the most respected scientific minds of the late 19th century. In July of 1886, Dr. Thomas Hargrove, a physician from Springfield, was summoned to the remote home of the Belle family. The journey took him nearly 2 days by horseback, navigating the winding paths that cut through the dense Ozark forests. The letter requesting his presence had been unusually urgent, carried by a local boy who had traveled all night to deliver it. A matter of utmost medical urgency, the letter had stated, written in a shaky hand that suggested great distress. Upon arrival, he was greeted by Samuel Belle, a stern-faced farmer whose weathered appearance spoke of decades working the unforgiving land. Samuel stood in the doorway of the stone house, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim interior. His eyes, Hargrove would later write, held the haunted look of a man who has witnessed something beyond his comprehension. "My wife," Samuel reportedly told the doctor, his voice barely above a whisper, "has taken ill in a manner I cannot explain." The doctor was led through the austere main room of the house, past a wooden table where a half-finished meal lay abandoned, and into a small bedroom at the rear. The room was unusually cold despite the July heat, the window shuttered tight against the afternoon sun. Nora Belle lay motionless on a simple bed, her complexion ashen, her breathing so shallow that Hargrove initially feared he had arrived too late. What Dr. Hargrove documented in his medical journal over the subsequent week would later be submitted to the Missouri Medical Monthly, only to be rejected for publication. The journal's editor, Dr. Walter Fleming, penned a brief note stating simply, "We cannot, in good conscience, publish accounts of phenomena that defy scientific explanation and border on the fantastical. To do so would undermine the credibility of this publication and the emerging standards of modern medicine." Those records remained sealed in the Springfield Historical Society archive until 1963, when historian Margaret Wheeler discovered them while researching rural medical practices of the post-Civil War era. Wheeler would later describe the moment of discovery. "I was examining a collection of personal papers donated by the Hargrove family when I came across a journal bound in faded red leather, its pages yellowed, but the handwriting impeccably preserved. The first entry began, 'I fear what I'm about to document will test the limits of medical science as we understand it.' The Belle homestead sat in a small clearing, approximately 7 miles from the nearest neighbor. The nearest town, Versailles, was a full day's journey on foot. This isolation would become a significant factor in what followed. According to census records from 1880, the household consisted of Samuel Belle, 42, his wife Nora Belle, 38, and Samuel's brother Edwin Belle, 46. No children are listed, though local church records indicate the Belles had lost 2 infants in previous years, a boy in 1873 and a girl in 1875, both before their first birthdays. The property was modest but well maintained. A vegetable garden stretched from the eastern side of the house to a small creek that provided water. A small field of corn, 3 dairy cows, and a chicken coop provided sustenance. The stone house contained 4 rooms, a common area, a kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. A root cellar extended beneath the structure, accessed via a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. This cellar, common in homes of that era for food preservation, would later become central to the mystery that unfolded. By all accounts, the Belles were unremarkable settlers. Samuel had moved west from Pennsylvania following the Civil War, in which he served as a Union soldier with the 71st Pennsylvania Infantry. Military records indicate he was present at Gettysburg, but was not wounded during the conflict. County records show he purchased the land in 1868 and married Nora Miller, daughter of a local carpenter, in 1871. Edwin joined his brother in 1875 after the failure of his leather goods business in St. Louis, bringing with him a modest library of books that suggested an education somewhat above average for the time and place. The family attended the Methodist Church in Versailles sporadically, primarily for Easter services and occasional summer gatherings. Neighbors described them as private but agreeable, though interactions were limited by geography and the demands of rural life. What little social contact they maintained occurred during infrequent trips to town for supplies or at seasonal community events such as harvest festivals. This ordinary existence was disrupted in the summer of 1886 when Nora Belle began exhibiting symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding. The precise timeline, reconstructed from Dr. Hargrove's notes and later interviews with Versailles residents conducted by Mueller, suggests the onset occurred in early June, approximately 6 weeks before the doctor's arrival. According to Dr. Hargrove's journal, Nora's condition began with ordinary complaints, fatigue, loss of appetite, and occasional disorientation. Samuel initially attributed these symptoms to the summer heat and the demanding nature of farm work. By mid-June, however, her condition had deteriorated significantly. The patient, Hargrove wrote on July 15, 1886, presents with severe pallor and appears to have lost considerable weight. Her pulse is steady but weak at approximately 50 beats per minute. Temperature normal at 98.4 degrees Fahrenheit. She reports an unusual sensitivity to light and sound, describing ordinary noises as thunderous and daylight as unbearably bright. Most concerning is her claim that she can feel the earth moving beneath her at all times, a sensation she likens to standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. Initial examinations revealed no obvious physical cause for these symptoms. Hargrove considered possibilities ranging from anemia to nervous exhaustion, common diagnoses in that era. What followed, however, was a progression of symptoms that increasingly alarmed both family and physician. Nora developed what Hargrove described as selective temporal perception. She could describe events that had not yet occurred, such as the arrival of unexpected visitors or sudden weather changes, while simultaneously being unable to recall recent conversations or activities. These episodes of premonition were initially dismissed as coincidence or the product of fevered imagination, but their accuracy became increasingly difficult to ignore. When questioned about breakfast, one entry notes, Mrs. Belle appears genuinely confused, insisting she has not eaten since the previous evening. Yet Mr. Belle confirms she consumed a full meal of eggs and bread merely 2 hours prior to our conversation. When presented with her unwashed plate as evidence, she examines it with the curiosity of a person seeing an unfamiliar object. More puzzling were the periods when Nora would speak fluently about scientific concepts that should have been well beyond her limited education. During one such episode, Hargrove transcribed her describing the principles of electromagnetic induction, work that had been published by Michael Faraday decades earlier, but would have been inaccessible to a farmer's wife in the Ozarks. The movement of a magnetic field relative to a conductor, she reportedly stated in a monotone voice, her eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, induces a current within that conductor. The magnitude of this current is proportional to the rate of change of the magnetic field. When later questioned about these statements, she had no recollection of making them, and expressed confusion about the terminology. Samuel Belle maintained that his wife had received only basic education at a country school and had never displayed any particular interest in scientific matters. The family owned few books, a Bible, a farmer's almanac, and a collection of folk remedies passed down from Nora's grandmother. None contained information on electromagnetic theory, or advanced physics. As July progressed, Nora's condition worsened. She began experiencing periods of complete catalepsy, during which her body would become rigid and unresponsive for hours at a time. These episodes typically occurred at dawn and dusk. During these states, her breathing would slow to nearly imperceptible levels, and her skin would become unusually cool to the touch, though never reaching the coldness associated with death. Upon recovery from these cataleptic states, she would report vivid experiences. Not dreams, she insisted, but journeys to distant locations. "I was not asleep," she told Hargrove after one such episode. "I was elsewhere. As truly as I am now sitting in this room, I was walking along a street lined with buildings taller than any church steeple." The descriptions she provided of these journeys included detailed observations of places she had never visited. The bustling streets of New York City with specific details about the elevated railway being constructed, the redwood forests of California with accurate descriptions of the indigenous Yurok people's fishing practices, the frozen landscapes of Alaska, with observations about Russian trading posts that still operated there. In one instance, she described witnessing a fire in a Chicago warehouse, providing specific details about the building's architecture and the methods used by firefighters to combat the blaze. 2 weeks later, a St. Louis newspaper reported a major fire matching her description down to the number of casualties and the name of the company that owned the structure. Dr. Hargrove, a man of science and rational thought, struggled to reconcile these occurrences with his medical training. In his journal, he confessed, "I find myself in the uncomfortable position of documenting phenomena that contradict every principle of medicine and natural philosophy I have been taught to revere. Yet I cannot, in good conscience, dismiss what I have observed with my own senses." He administered the standard treatments of the era: cold compresses for fever, herbal sedatives for nervousness, and nutritional supplements to address her wasting appearance. None produced any improvement. If anything, the administration of laudanum, a common remedy for nervous conditions, seemed to exacerbate her symptoms, intensifying both her premonitions and her cataleptic episodes. In his frustration, he wrote to colleagues at the Medical College in St. Louis, describing the case in careful detail while omitting the more inexplicable elements. Their responses suggested possibilities ranging from hysteria, a catch-all diagnosis for unexplained female ailments in the 19th century, to brain fever to some unknown parasitic infection acquired from the wilderness surrounding the Belle property. One correspondent, Dr. William Harrison, suggested that the case might represent a rare form of temporal lobe epilepsy, a relatively new diagnosis at the time, which could account for some of Nora's symptoms. However, Harrison acknowledged that this would not explain her apparent knowledge of distant events or scientific principles. On July 17, 1886, Hargrove's journal records a disturbing development. During a period of lucidity, Nora Belle requested a private consultation with the doctor. Samuel reluctantly left the room, casting anxious glances backward as he closed the door. Once alone, Nora spoke in hushed tones, her eyes constantly darting to the door as if fearing interruption. "There is something beneath this house," she reportedly told him, her voice trembling. "Something that should not be disturbed. Edwin knows. Ask Edwin what they found when they dug the cellar." When Hargrove inquired why she did not ask Edwin herself, her response was cryptic. "He watches me now. They both do. They think I don't notice how they whisper when they think I'm having one of my episodes. They're afraid of what I might remember." When questioned later, Edwin Belle became visibly agitated, his hands shaking as he fumbled to light his pipe. He refused to discuss the matter, claiming his sister-in-law was touched in the head and should not be humored in her delusions. Samuel, standing nearby during this exchange, appeared unusually pale, a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. He suggested that perhaps the doctor should return to Springfield, as Nora seemed to be improving. "We've imposed on your time long enough," Samuel said, placing a hand on Edwin's shoulder as if to steady him. The worst seems to have passed. My wife has always had a vivid imagination. Perhaps the isolation of our home has simply allowed it to run unchecked. Hargrove, however, was not prepared to abandon such an unusual case. He took a room at the small inn in Versailles and continued his visits to the Belle homestead, documenting each development with scientific precision. The innkeeper, Martha Simmons, later recalled to historian Wheeler that the doctor seemed increasingly preoccupied during his stays, often working late into the night by lamplight, making detailed sketches and consulting medical texts he had brought with him from Springfield. During his absence, the situation at the Belle home deteriorated further. Upon his return on July 20th, he found Samuel haggard and sleepless, with several days' growth of beard and bloodshot eyes. Edwin was nowhere to be seen, having reportedly departed for St. Louis on business, a journey that would typically take several days by horse and rail. "She knows things," Samuel told the doctor, his voice barely above a whisper as they stood in the yard well away from the house. "Things no one should know. Last night she recited the details of my mother's death, the exact words spoken, the precise arrangement of furniture in the room. She described the pattern on the quilt my mother made before I was born, the one that covered her as she passed. I never told her these things. My mother died before I met Nora." When Hargrove suggested that perhaps Edwin had shared these details with Nora years earlier, Samuel shook his head vehemently. Edwin wasn't there. He was still in Philadelphia when Mother died. He doesn't know these things himself. That evening, as dusk settled over the Ozark hills, Nora Belle experienced another cataleptic episode. This one was different, however. Rather than lying rigid and still, her body began to emit a low humming sound. According to Hargrove's account, the sound was not coming from her throat but seemed to emanate from her entire form, as if she were an instrument being played by unseen hands. "The vibration was palpable," he wrote. "When I placed my hand near, not touching, her arm, I could feel a distinct tremor in the air, similar to what one experiences when standing near a large bell after it has been struck. Yet there was no visible movement of her body." The humming continued for exactly 17 minutes, during which time compass needles in Hargrove's medical kit reportedly spun wildly and his pocket watch stopped functioning. The room temperature dropped noticeably, causing the doctor's breath to fog in the air despite the summer evening. When the humming ceased, Nora awoke with a gasp and immediately began to speak in what Hargrove described as an archaic form of English, reminiscent of Chaucer or early Shakespeare. Her voice had changed in quality as well, deeper, more resonant, with an accent he could not place. The words she spoke were recorded verbatim in his journal. "Beneath the stones, where water meets the earth, the old ones left their mark. They knew the paths between the stars and how to walk them. The vessel awakens, the vessel remembers. Time bends toward the knowing." Samuel Belle's reaction to this pronouncement was unexpected. Rather than displaying confusion or concern, he appeared resigned, even fearful. His shoulders slumped, and he sank into a chair by Nora's bedside, taking her hand in his. "It's happening again," he said quietly, "just like with the Talbot family in '49. When pressed for explanation, Samuel reluctantly shared a local legend about a family that had settled in the area decades earlier. According to the story, Martha Talbot had experienced similar symptoms after her husband discovered an unusual stone formation while digging a well on their property. The entire family subsequently vanished, their farm found abandoned in the spring of 1850. Local authorities concluded they had moved westward during the winter, though no record of their journey was ever documented. "They left everything behind," Samuel explained. "Food still on the table, clothes still in the wardrobes. Their livestock was found dead in the barn, not from neglect, but arranged in a circle, their heads pointing inward. No one would purchase the land after that. It remained empty until the county reclaimed it for unpaid taxes in '65. The Belle property, it emerged, was located less than 2 miles from the former Talbot homestead, When asked why he had chosen to settle so close to a place with such an ominous history, Samuel admitted that the story had not been shared with him until after he had already established his farm. The local reluctance to discuss the Talbot incident had kept it from becoming widely known outside the immediate area. "These hills keep their secrets," he said, gazing out the small bedroom window toward the darkening forest. "Perhaps they should remain kept." Hargrove's scientific curiosity now fully engaged, he began to investigate the geological peculiarities of the region. His journal indicates that he collected soil and water samples from the Belle property, particularly from the area around the root cellar. He arranged to have these samples analyzed by a colleague at Washington University in St. Louis, Professor Elias Montgomery, a chemist known for his pioneering work in mineral analysis. The preliminary findings, received via telegraph on July 25th, indicated unusual mineral compositions, including high concentrations of iron, quartz crystals of uncommon purity, and traces of elements the chemist could not readily identify with available techniques. Montgomery's telegram concluded with a request that was unusual for a man of science. "Exercise caution. Stop similar samples from New Madrid region preceded 1811. Seismic events. Stop geological instability possible. Stop will arrive Versailles. August 15th to examine site personally stop." The reference to the New Madrid earthquakes, a series of massive seismic events that had dramatically altered the landscape of southeastern Missouri some 75 years earlier, suggested that Montgomery suspected a connection between the mineral anomalies and geological instability. More puzzling was the report that compass needles placed near the samples exhibited the same erratic behavior Hargrove had observed during Nora's episodes. However, the Ozark region had no history of significant seismic activity, making the comparison puzzling. On July 27, 1886, Dr. Hargrove returned to the Belle property to find Samuel alone in the house. Nora, he explained with evident discomfort, had been moved to the barn the previous night after her condition took a concerning turn. The doctor found her lying on a makeshift bed of straw, her breathing shallow but regular, her skin cool to the touch despite the summer heat. "She became too difficult to manage in the house," Samuel explained, standing at a distance from his wife. "The episodes are coming more frequently now, and with greater intensity." Most alarming was the discovery that small objects, pins, buttons, a letter opener, and similar metallic items, appeared to cling to her skin without falling, defying gravity in a manner Hargrove could not explain. When he attempted to document this phenomenon with his camera, the photographic plates were later found to be inexplicably fogged, showing only Nora's silhouette, surrounded by a strange luminescence. In his journal, Hargrove wrote, "I have witnessed countless illnesses from the mundane to the exotic in my 20 years of medical practice. Never have I encountered a condition that affects the physical world around the patient. It is as if Mrs. Belle has become a nexus of unknown forces, a living anomaly in the natural order." By this point, word of the unusual case had spread through the scattered communities of Morgan County. On July 29th, Reverend William Hobbs from the Versailles Methodist Church arrived at the Belle property, accompanied by 3 church elders. They had come, they said, to offer prayers for Nora's recovery. Hargrove's journal records a tense conversation between Samuel Belle and Reverend Hobbs, with the latter suggesting that Nora's affliction might be spiritual rather than physical in nature. The implication that demonic influence might be involved was clear, though carefully couched in euphemistic language. Samuel vehemently rejected this characterization, insisting that his wife was ill, not possessed, and that science, not faith, would provide answers. The exchange grew heated, with Samuel ultimately ordering the Reverend and his companions off his property. "My wife needs a doctor, not an exorcist," he reportedly shouted, as the churchmen retreated to their wagon. The Reverend and his companions were not permitted to see Nora, and they departed with expressions of concern and promises to keep the Belle family in their prayers. As they left, one of the elders was overheard remarking, "The darkness has that whole place in its grip. Mark my words, No good will come of what's happening there. That night, according to Hargrove, a summer storm of unusual intensity swept through the region. Lightning struck the Belle property multiple times, with one bolt hitting a large oak tree approximately 50 yards from the house, splitting it down the middle. The air was reportedly filled with a palpable electricity, causing the hair on Hargrove's arms to stand on end, even inside the relative shelter of the barn where he had taken refuge with Samuel and the now unconscious Nora. The lightning seemed drawn to this place, Hargrove wrote. I have observed electrical storms throughout my life, but never have I seen such concentrated fury, as if the very sky were focusing its energy on this small patch of earth. In the storm's aftermath, Edwin Belle unexpectedly returned from St. Louis. His demeanor was changed. Where before he had been evasive and irritable, he now appeared resolved, even grim. The rain had soaked him to the skin, suggesting he had ridden through the night despite the dangerous conditions. He carried with him a leather satchel, which he clutched tightly to his chest, refusing to relinquish it, even as Samuel helped him remove his sodden coat. Once dry and seated before the fireplace in the main room, Edwin opened the satchel and removed a journal bound in faded green leather, its pages swollen slightly from the humidity. He presented it to Dr. Hargrove with a solemnity that bordered on reverence. This belonged to Johannes Mueller, a German geologist who surveyed this region in 1851, Edwin explained. I found it in the university archives. You should read what he discovered about the limestone formations in these hills. The Mueller journal, excerpts of which Hargrove copied into his own records, contained detailed observations of unusual geomagnetic anomalies throughout what is now Morgan County. Mueller had documented inexplicable compass variations, localized temperature fluctuations, and strange effects on plant and animal life in specific locations. Most significant was his description of a series of underground chambers discovered during his survey, chambers not formed by natural erosion, but seemingly constructed with precision. The walls bear markings unlike any known human language, Mueller had written. The local indigenous peoples avoid these places, calling them the speaking stones in their dialect. They believe the chambers were created by visitors from the sky in times beyond memory, though I am inclined to attribute their construction to some pre-Columbian civilization not yet documented in our archaeological record. Mueller's entries became increasingly speculative as they progressed, suggesting that the chambers might function as some sort of resonance network, though he did not clarify what purpose such a network might serve. His final entries contained detailed measurements of magnetic field strengths at various points in the region, along with calculations and equations that Hargrove, not being a physicist, could not interpret. Mueller's journal ended abruptly in September 1851. According to a marginal note added by a university archivist, he had vanished while conducting field research near what would later become the Belle property. His equipment was found neatly arranged beside a survey marker, but of Mueller himself, no trace was ever discovered, despite an extensive search by local authorities. Edwin Belle confirmed what Hargrove had begun to suspect. The Belle property sat directly above one of Mueller's documented chambers. The root cellar, dug years before the Belles purchased the land, intersected with the upper portion of this ancient structure. When we first moved here, Edwin confessed, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though they were alone in the room, Samuel and I found an opening in the cellar wall, a passage leading downward. We explored it briefly but sealed it up after— He paused, unwilling or unable to continue. After what? Hargrove pressed, leaning forward in his chair. After we began having the dreams, Edwin finally replied, his gaze fixed on the flickering fire rather than meeting the doctor's eyes. Dreams of distant places and times. Dreams that felt more real than waking. Samuel's stopped when we sealed the passage. Mine never did. The brothers had plastered over the opening and never spoken of it again, not even to each other. But Edwin now believed that something from that sealed chamber was affecting Nora, perhaps, he suggested, through the groundwater that fed their well or through some energy that permeated the soil itself. I think, Edwin said hesitantly, that whatever is down there, it's been waiting, and now it's found what it needs in Nora. When asked to elaborate on this cryptic statement, Edwin shook his head. I've said too much already. Read Mueller's journal. He suspected, but couldn't bring himself to write it explicitly. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve, even in private records. On August 2, 1886, Dr. Hargrove made the decision to examine the sealed passage. His journal describes the atmosphere in the root cellar as oppressively still, the air noticeably cooler than the summer heat above ground, yet dry rather than damp, as one would expect in such a space. The cellar itself was a simple room dug into the earth beneath the kitchen, its walls lined with stone to prevent collapse. Rough-hewn shelves held preserved foods in glass jars, their contents casting distorted shadows in the lamplight. Root vegetables lay in wooden crates on the packed earth floor. In the far corner, partially concealed behind a stack of empty crates, was a section of wall that differed from the rest, newer mortar visible between the stones. The plastered section of wall was readily apparent, newer than the surrounding stonework and slightly discolored. With Samuel's reluctant permission, Hargrove began to remove the covering, revealing a narrow aperture approximately 3 feet in height. The opening emanated a faint but perceptible draft of cool air with a mineral scent. The passage beyond, he wrote, descends at a gentle angle into darkness. The walls appear to be composed of the same limestone as the surrounding bedrock, yet the precision of their shaping suggests artificial construction rather than natural formation. Most remarkable are the faint markings visible on the surfaces, geometric patterns, and symbols, unlike any writing system known to me. A curious detail noted in his journal was the complete absence of dust or cobwebs within the passage, despite its having been sealed for many years. The air that flowed from the opening was described as strangely invigorating, carrying a faint scent reminiscent of ozone after a lightning strike. Hargrove's exploration was limited by the inadequacy of his lamp and the increasing reluctance of Samuel Belle, who refused to venture into the passage himself. The doctor descended approximately 20 feet before reaching a point where the tunnel branched in 3 directions. Lacking proper equipment and fearing disorientation, he prudently chose to return to the surface, planning a more thorough expedition with better preparation. The acoustic properties of the passage are unlike anything I have experienced, he recorded. My footsteps produced echoes that seemed to return from multiple directions simultaneously, creating an unsettling chorus that persisted long after I had ceased moving. More disturbing still was the distinct impression that some of these echoes preceded rather than followed my movements, as if the sound were reaching me before its cause had occurred. That night, Nora Belle's condition changed dramatically. The cataleptic episode ceased, and she fell into what appeared to be natural sleep for the first time in weeks. Upon waking the following morning, she claimed to feel refreshed and clear-minded. She had no recollection of her strange behavior or statements and expressed surprise at finding herself in the barn rather than her bedroom. Samuel, cautiously optimistic, allowed her to return to the house. For several hours, the atmosphere approached normalcy. Nora prepared a simple breakfast, conversed lucidly about mundane matters, and even hummed softly as she tended to household tasks, an ordinary domestic scene that belied the weeks of inexplicable phenomena. The improvement was short-lived. By midday, she began to experience intense headaches and nosebleeds. More troubling was her insistence that she could hear the stones speaking beneath the house. When asked what they were saying, she replied simply, "They're calling me home." By late afternoon, her speech had begun to alternate between English and the same archaic form she had used previously, sometimes mid-sentence. Her movements became increasingly erratic, moments of complete stillness interrupted by sudden, purposeful actions that she seemed unable to explain or justify. I found her arranging kitchen utensils on the floor in a precise geometric pattern, Samuel reported to Hargrove. When I asked what she was doing, she looked at me as if I were a stranger, then said, "Calibrating the field." It needs to be exact. I don't know what that means, Doctor. I don't think she does either. On August 4th, Hargrove returned to find the Belle home in a state of disarray. Furniture had been overturned, windows broken from the inside out. Fragments of glass littered the yard, catching the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Edwin sat alone at the kitchen table, his hands bandaged, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him. Samuel and Nora were nowhere to be found. "They've gone below," Edwin stated flatly when questioned, his eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. Samuel said he had no choice. She was changing, becoming something else. Edwin's account of the preceding 24 hours was fragmented and at times incoherent. He described Nora developing unusual physical characteristics, her skin taking on a faint luminescence in darkness, her eyes reflecting light like those of a nocturnal animal. Most disturbing was his claim that metallic objects had begun to orbit around her when she entered certain emotional states, as if gravity itself responded to her distress. It was like watching the planets circle the sun, he said, gesturing expansively with his bandaged hand. Only she was the sun, you understand? And everything else just followed. Natural law breaking down around her. The breaking point had come in the night, when Nora had apparently entered a frenzied state, tearing through the house as if searching for something while speaking rapidly in multiple languages, some recognizable, others utterly foreign. When the brothers attempted to restrain her, she had displayed strength far beyond her wasted frame, hurling Edwin across the room with enough force to shatter the window he struck. Samuel, desperate and exhausted, had decided to take Nora into the passage beneath their home. His reasoning, as related by Edwin, was that perhaps whatever influence was affecting her would be satisfied if she returned to its source. "He believes she'll get better down there," Edwin explained, pouring another measure of whiskey with shaking hands, "that whatever is happening will run its course, and they can return. I wanted to go with them, but someone had to remain here. Someone had to tell you." Dr. Hargrove, now genuinely alarmed, gathered supplies from his medical bag and prepared to enter the passage. Edwin's final words before the doctor descended were ominous. "If they come back, Doctor, look at their eyes carefully. That's how you'll know if it's really them." What Hargrove found in the chambers beneath the Belle property was documented in the final pages of his journal, pages that were later removed from the bound volume and stored separately in the Springfield Historical Society archives. These pages were not discovered by Margaret Wheeler in 1963. They surfaced only in 1968 during a cataloging project led by archivist Robert Keller. According to these records, Hargrove followed the passage for nearly half a mile, descending deeper into the earth through a series of chambers. The walls of these spaces were covered with intricate carvings, symbols, and diagrams that appeared to depict astronomical phenomena, though rendered in ways that did not correspond to any known scientific model of the era. "The precision of these renderings is remarkable," Hargrove wrote. "They show celestial arrangements that I cannot identify, perhaps constellations as viewed from another point on Earth, or possibly depicting the sky as it appeared thousands of years ago. Most curious are the connecting lines between certain stars, forming patterns that suggest intentional pathways rather than the arbitrary constructions of human imagination." As he progressed deeper, Hargrove noted that his lamp burned with unusual brightness despite the limited air supply. His compass had ceased functioning entirely, the needle spinning continuously rather than settling in any consistent direction. His pocket watch, which had resumed normal operation after Nora's earlier episode, now ran at varying speeds, sometimes advancing multiple hours in what seemed like minutes, at other times appearing to stop altogether. In the largest chamber, approximately 300 feet below the surface by Hargrove's estimation, he discovered Samuel Belle seated on the ground, staring at what the doctor described as a vertical surface of perfect blackness, as if a portion of the chamber had been painted with a substance that absorbed all light. The surface was roughly rectangular, approximately 7 feet in height and 4 feet in width. Despite the doctor's lamp being directed at it, the blackness remained absolute, reflecting nothing. Nora was nowhere to be seen. When questioned, Samuel spoke in monotone, explaining that Nora had passed through the black surface after touching the symbols carved into the surrounding walls in a specific sequence. He had been unwilling or unable to follow her. She said she understood everything now, Samuel told Hargrove, his voice devoid of emotion. She said time is not a river, but an ocean, and that those who made this place knew how to navigate its currents. She said the stones have been waiting for someone who could hear them. She promised she would return, but I don't think it will be her, not really. When asked to clarify this statement, Samuel simply shook his head. You read Mueller's journal. You know what happened to him. He found one of these doorways, too. He went through, but something else came back. Hargrove's scientific mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. He documented his observations with clinical detachment, noting that the black surface defied conventional physical properties. Objects thrown at it disappeared without sound or resistance, and thermometers registered no temperature difference between it and the surrounding air. Most significant was his observation that his compass, which had behaved erratically throughout the chambers, pointed directly at the black surface regardless of orientation, as if it represented a magnetic north more powerful than the Earth's own. I confess, Hargrove wrote, that despite my commitment to scientific principles and rational investigation, I experienced a profound sense of dread in the presence of this inexplicable phenomenon. It is as if some instinctive part of the human mind recognizes the wrongness of what lies before it, a violation of natural law that triggers an ancient warning system embedded in our very being. Samuel seemed unwilling or unable to leave his position before the black surface. When Hargrove attempted to lead him away, he resisted with surprising strength, insisting that he needed to wait for Nora's return. She'll come back through, he muttered repeatedly. She promised. She always keeps her promises. After several hours of observation and unsuccessful attempts to communicate further with the near catatonic Samuel, Hargrove made the difficult decision to return to the surface for additional help. He left Samuel with provisions from his medical bag, water, bread, and a small dose of laudanum to calm his nerves, and promised to return promptly with assistance. The journey back through the winding passages was complicated by Hargrove's increasing disorientation. Time and distance seemed distorted in these chambers, he wrote. Passages that I am certain took only minutes to traverse on my descent now seemed to extend for much longer periods. Several times I found myself returning to chambers I believed I had already left behind, though I had made no discernible turns or deviations from my path. Eventually, he emerged into the root cellar only to discover that night had fallen, though, by his calculation, he had spent only a few hours below ground. Edwin was nowhere to be found in the house, which remained in the same state of disarray as before. Upon reaching the yard, Hargrove was met with a horrifying sight. The Belle house was ablaze, flames leaping from the windows and through the partially collapsed roof. The intensity of the heat prevented any approach to the structure. Of Edwin Belle, there was no sign. The conflagration appeared to have been burning for some time, Hargrove noted, yet I had neither seen nor smelled smoke during my ascent from the chambers, though the root cellar connects directly to the kitchen above. This temporal discrepancy reinforces my growing suspicion that the laws of physics operate differently in proximity to the underground structure. Hargrove rode immediately to Versailles to raise the alarm, but by the time a response could be organized, the stone structure had been gutted, the wooden elements entirely consumed. The volunteer fire brigade from Versailles arrived shortly before dawn, but their efforts were limited to preventing the spread of the blaze to the surrounding forest. The men were reluctant to approach the property, Hargrove observed. Word of the strange occurrences had clearly spread throughout the community, and I detected a deep-seated fear in their demeanor, not merely of the fire, but of the place itself. The following day, a search party ventured to the property, comprised of the sheriff, 2 deputies, Reverend Hobbs, and several volunteers from Versailles. Hargrove accompanied them, though he noted that he was treated with a certain wariness, as if his association with the Belles had somehow tainted him. The entrance to the root cellar was found collapsed. Whether from the fire's damage to supporting timbers or from deliberate action was impossible to determine. Attempts to excavate were hampered by continuing heat from smoldering debris and were ultimately abandoned after the discovery of human remains, presumed to be Edwin Belle, though formal identification was never conclusively established due to the condition of the body. The positioning of the remains suggests that the deceased was attempting to seal the cellar entrance when death occurred, Hargrove wrote. The hands were found clutching a wooden beam that appears to have been used as a brace against the cellar door. Whether this represents an attempt to prevent something from emerging or to ensure that no one else would descend into the chambers remains unclear. Samuel Belle and his wife Nora were officially declared missing. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding forests and inquiries in neighboring communities, no trace of them was ever found. Sheriff Thomas Wilson formally concluded that they had perished in the fire, though this determination was made largely for administrative convenience, given the lack of physical evidence. Reverend Hobbs insisted on conducting a brief service at the site before departing, though Hargrove noted that the prayer offered seemed more an exorcism than a eulogy, focusing heavily on themes of eternal rest and the containment of unnatural forces. Dr. Thomas Hargrove returned to Springfield 2 weeks later. His colleagues noted a marked change in his demeanor. The once garrulous and enthusiastic physician had become withdrawn and preoccupied. He continued his medical practice but declined to discuss his experiences in Morgan County, even with close friends. "I observed Dr. Hargrove for several months after his return," wrote Dr. James Whitaker, a fellow physician, in a letter to Margaret Wheeler in 1964. "He was a changed man, jumpy, distracted, prone to staring into space for long periods. He developed an obsessive interest in geology and physics, subjects previously outside his professional focus. Most concerning was his habit of checking his pocket watch constantly, as if deeply worried about the passage of time." In March of 1887, Hargrove submitted his detailed case notes to the Missouri Medical Monthly, along with samples of stone collected from the chambers beneath the Belle property. The journal's rejection of his article was followed by the return of all materials, except the stone samples, which were reportedly retained for further study, but subsequently lost in a fire that damaged part of the journal's offices in 1889. Hargrove's health declined steadily in the years that followed. Colleagues attributed this to overwork and the psychological strain of his frontier medical practice, but those closest to him suspected a deeper cause. He developed a persistent cough that did not respond to treatment and lost weight steadily, despite maintaining a healthy appetite. In the winter of 1891-1892, he contracted what was initially diagnosed as a routine case of pneumonia. The illness progressed with unusual rapidity, however, and he died on February 17, 1892, at the age of 53. His personal effects, including his journal, were donated to the Springfield Historical Society by his sister, Catherine Hargrove Williams. "My brother was not himself after returning from Morgan County," Catherine wrote in the letter, accompanying her donation. "Whatever he experienced there haunted him until his dying day. He would wake in the night, claiming he could hear stones whispering. In his final hours, he spoke of Nora Belle as if she were in the room with him, though they had not met in over 5 years. The land where the Belle home once stood remained unclaimed for decades. Local residents avoided the area, citing vague but persistent rumors of strange lights and unexplained sounds. Hunters reported unusual behavior in wildlife near the former homestead, birds flying in perfect geometric formations, deer standing motionless for hours, facing the ruins of the house. In 1927, Morgan County records show the property was purchased by the newly formed Lake of the Ozarks Development Company as part of a larger acquisition of land in anticipation of the construction of Bagnell Dam. The company's geological survey of the area made brief mention of unusual magnetic properties in the soil near the former Belle homestead, but did not elaborate on these findings. When the dam was completed in 1931 and the lake began to fill, portions of the former Belle property were submerged. The site of the house itself remains above water, now located on a peninsula extending into the lake approximately 7 miles west of Gravois Mills. Development of the area for recreational purposes was attempted twice, in 1947 and again in 1955, but both projects were abandoned after experiencing what company records vaguely describe as engineering difficulties and unexplained equipment failures. In 1963, historian Margaret Wheeler's discovery of Hargrove's journal sparked renewed interest in the case. Her preliminary article in the Missouri Historical Review drew attention from various quarters, including Dr. James Livingston, a geophysicist from the University of Missouri who had been studying magnetic anomalies in the Ozark region. Wheeler's description of the Belle case immediately resonated with my own research, Livingston wrote in his field notes. The unusual magnetic properties reported by Hargrove correspond precisely with the anomalies I've been tracking throughout this region. The Ozarks contain dozens of localized magnetic aberrations that defy conventional geological explanation. Livingston conducted field research at the former Belle property in the summer of 1964. His instruments detected significant geomagnetic irregularities consistent with those described in both Hargrove's journal and the earlier work of Johannes Mueller. Attempts to locate the underground chambers, however, were unsuccessful. Ground-penetrating radar revealed no cavities beneath the surface, despite historical documentation of their existence. It's as if the passages have been erased from physical reality, Livingston noted with evident frustration. Or, more disturbing still, as if they exist in a phase state that our instruments cannot detect. The magnetic anomalies clearly indicate something substantial beneath the surface, yet we can find no physical correspondence to these readings. The most puzzling development occurred in October 1964, when Wheeler received an envelope containing a photograph and a brief note. The envelope bore no return address, and the postmark indicated it had been mailed from San Francisco. The photograph, a Polaroid image apparently taken on a city street, showed a woman bearing a striking resemblance to Nora Belle based on the single existing daguerreotype from the 1880s. More remarkable was the fact that the woman appeared virtually identical in age and appearance, despite the passage of nearly 80 years. The accompanying note read simply, "Time is not a river, but an ocean. Some of us learn to swim." It was signed NB and dated October 12, 1964. Wheeler immediately contacted Livingston, who arranged for analysis of the photograph by experts at the university. Their conclusion was that while the image showed no signs of manipulation, it was impossible to definitively identify the subject as Nora Belle, given the limited reference material available for comparison. The clothing and hairstyle of the woman were contemporary to 1964, and the background clearly showed a portion of Market Street in San Francisco, identifiable by distinctive architectural elements. The source of the envelope was never traced. Wheeler's subsequent attempts to locate the woman in the photograph in San Francisco proved fruitless. Private investigators hired by the university canvassed the area where the photograph appeared to have been taken, but found no one matching the description. The most rational explanation is that this is merely an unusual resemblance, perhaps a descendant of the Belle family, combined with a hoax perpetrated by someone familiar with the case, Livingston concluded in his report to the university. Yet I cannot dismiss entirely the possibility that something truly extraordinary occurred in those chambers beneath the Ozark Hills, something that science, as we currently understand it, cannot explain. In 1968, the complete Hargrove journal, including the previously segregated final pages, was made available to researchers, though access was restricted to those with academic credentials. Wheeler and Livingston collaborated on a comprehensive study of the case, integrating Hargrove's observations with Livingston's geophysical research and additional historical context uncovered through interviews with elderly residents of Morgan County. Their work attracted limited attention from mainstream academia, but developed a small following among researchers interested in geomagnetic anomalies and their potential effects on human cognition and perception. Several fringe scientific publications suggested that the Belle case might represent an early documented instance of what they termed geomagnetic consciousness alteration, a theoretical phenomenon in which intense or unusual magnetic fields might affect brain function in ways that alter perception of time and space. Livingston continued his investigation until 1968, when funding was withdrawn following criticism from university administrators who considered the project speculative and unscientific. His preliminary findings, published in an obscure geophysical journal, suggested that certain limestone formations in the Ozarks possessed unique properties that could potentially affect electromagnetic fields and, by extension, neurological functions in humans exposed to them over prolonged periods. The chemical composition of these formations includes rare earth elements in unusual concentrations, he wrote. Their crystalline structure differs subtly but significantly from standard limestone, creating what might be described as a natural semiconductor network throughout the region. The implications for how such formations might interact with the electromagnetic fields generated by the human brain are profound and warrant further investigation. The case of Nora Belle faded into obscurity, occasionally referenced in compilations of regional folklore, but rarely subjected to serious scientific or historical scrutiny. The original Belle property, now located within a private resort development, bears no marker or indication of its unusual history. In 1969, a final curious postscript was added to the story. During the Apollo 11 mission, astronaut Neil Armstrong reported momentary instrument anomalies while passing over a section of Missouri during Earth orbit. NASA records indicate the spacecraft was directly above the Lake of the Ozarks region at that precise moment. The incident was classified as an equipment malfunction and not investigated further. 20 years later, in 1989, a geological survey conducted by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources identified a series of what they termed gravitational microvariations throughout the Ozarks, including a particularly pronounced anomaly centered on the former Belle property. The report described these variations as minor fluctuations in gravitational field strength that fall within acceptable parameters for the region's known geological composition and recommended no further investigation. A visiting professor from MIT, Dr. Eleanor Chambers, reviewed this data in 1992 and noted striking similarities to gravitational anomalies recorded near certain ancient megalithic sites in Europe and South America. Her request to conduct more detailed measurements was denied by the property's current owners, a development corporation based in Kansas City. The stone house that once belonged to the Belle family has been rebuilt and renovated multiple times over the decades. Current residents report no unusual phenomena, though occasional visitors to the lake in that vicinity have described experiencing momentary disorientation and, in some cases, vivid dreams of distant places and times they have never visited. "I've been coming to this cove for fishing trips since I was a boy," reported Michael Danvers, a retired schoolteacher from St. Louis, in an interview with a local newspaper in 2002. "There's one spot right where that old foundation is where my compass goes haywire every time. Digital equipment too. Watches stop, cell phones lose signal. Most folks just chalk it up to some kind of mineral deposit in the ground. But sometimes, sitting in my boat in the evening, I swear I can hear a woman's voice coming from somewhere deep, below the water, speaking words I can't quite make out." Perhaps what happened to Nora Belle in the summer of 1886 was merely the manifestation of an unknown neurological condition, exacerbated by isolation and the psychological stresses of rural life. Perhaps the chambers beneath her home were nothing more than natural formations, their seemingly artificial characteristics a product of Dr. Hargrove's increasingly disturbed imagination. Or perhaps, as both Mueller and Hargrove suggested in their respective journals, there are aspects of our world that 19th century science, and indeed even our modern understanding, cannot fully explain. Perhaps there are places where the conventional rules of reality grow thin, where what we perceive as immutable laws become merely suggestions. The records remain in the Springfield Historical Society archives, available to those with the curiosity to seek them out. The land remains, bearing no visible scars of its strange history. And somewhere, perhaps, Nora Belle remains as well, walking paths between the stars that the rest of us cannot see, navigating the ocean of time that we perceive only as a river flowing in one direction. In 2018, a hiker reported finding a small cairn of stones near the original Belle property site, arranged in a precise geometric pattern that matched one of the symbols described in Hargrove's journal. By the time researchers arrived to document it, the formation had been scattered. Whether by wildlife or human interference remains unknown. The most recent mention of the case came in 2022, when an elderly woman was found wandering along Highway 5 near the turnoff to the former Belle property. She was disoriented and suffering from exposure, but otherwise in good health. After treatment at a regional hospital, she was transferred to a care facility in Jefferson City, where staff reported that she would spend hours staring out the window toward the southwest, in the direction of the Lake of the Ozarks, murmuring about the speaking stones and the doorways between the stars. The next time you find yourself near the Lake of the Ozarks, perhaps driving along Highway 5 as it winds through Morgan County, take a moment to look toward the densely wooded peninsulas that extend into the water. When questioned by local authorities, she identified herself as Eleanor Mueller and claimed to be searching for her grandfather, Johannes. No identification was found on her person, and subsequent investigation failed to locate any family members. In one of those secluded spots stands what remains of the Belle property. It is simply a place now, stones and soil and trees indistinguishable from countless others in the Ozark Hills. But if you should stop and walk among those trees, and if you should feel a sudden disorientation, a momentary sense that time has slipped somehow, listen carefully. The stones may be speaking to you as well. And if you happen to encounter a woman with knowing eyes and a timeless face, walking purposefully along the shoreline, as if searching for something long forgotten, a woman who seems both of this world and somehow apart from it, perhaps you would be wise not to follow where she leads. For some journeys once begun cannot be undone. Some paths once walked transform the traveler in ways that science still cannot explain.